I'm Alex Harper Davies, and I'm the head of the penetration testing practice at Evalian. And with me, I have
Rory Hattingh. So I've been a pen tester for about 4 years now. I am sort of your jack of all trades type pen tester. Been with Evalian now for just over a year, and yeah, thoroughly enjoying it.
Today we're looking at red team testing and maybe some other alternatives for companies who it doesn't quite suit. Give us a bit of a brief background on what red team testing is, what it looks like.
It differs from pen testing in that pen testing is looking for as many vulnerabilities as possible. So you go into a network, you scan it, you run a whole bunch of tests, you hack it every which way possible. You're very loud. You don't really care. You're not there to evade anything, or you're just there to find as many things as possible so that the company knows where they're vulnerable and they can patch everything at once. Red teaming, on the other hand, you're more testing the company's security measures that are in place, as well as their response to those security measures. So it can be testing their SOC, it can be testing their AV, their EDR, what notifications are popping up for them, so they can see how they would respond in a real-world type scenario.
Is red team testing crucial for organizations? Should everybody be looking at it?
In my personal opinion, I would say no. It's not something that I would recommend to every client. Red teaming is something that a client should only undertake once they're more mature in their security journey, once they've had a few pen tests, they sort of know their way around the block, that sort of thing. Because it's pointless having a red team finding a very specific vulnerability that allowed you to own their entire network when there's another 50 that you could have found on a simple audit or a internal or external penetration test. So it's more for a company that's further along in their security journey.
Yeah, so by design, it's going to have gaps in the findings that you might otherwise have had in a regular pen test.
Correct.
So if you wouldn't recommend that to everybody, are there other alternatives that get similar sort of value?
Essentially, red teaming does have a lot of valuable parts that do provide value, especially to SMEs who would normally not really undertake red teaming. If we think about red teaming in the traditional sense of the word, it's usually something that a large corporate like Intel or Apple, something that's targeted by your nation state level threat actors, would undertake. So a lot of things like the physical aspect of it, the large amounts of OSINT, phishing, for an example, a lot of companies, they don't necessarily find as much value in that, but where they would find value is actually looking at or knowing about their public infrastructure. A lot of companies, they don't actually know what they look like in terms of an attack surface, right? What can someone from the outside actually see when it comes to that company? And that's where red teaming is very valuable, because if you think about it, in a penetration test, you're often given the targets to attack. And if, say, for example, you have X amount of internal and external penetration tests, or even web app, over a few years, usually you're given that same address space every single time. But just because you're given an IP address doesn't necessarily mean that you're hitting the service behind it. There's things like virtual host routing, just as one example, that you wouldn't necessarily see unless you were doing something like subdomain enumeration. And that's where I see the value in red teaming, is that it goes in above and beyond what the client even knows their network looks like.
So I guess typically the blocker for companies in engaging with red teams is going to be cost, because to assess a space that big is going to take a significant amount of time. If a company didn't have the budget for a red team assessment, is there something else they can do to get a similar test of their wider security posture without outlaying quite so much cash?
Yes, and that's something we've actually thought quite a bit about at Evalian. And we've created a new product called Red Team Lite, where it takes value from red teaming, but sort of skips the fat and allows us to produce something in a much shorter period of time for a much lower cost than a normal red team engagement.
So what's the structure of a Red Team Lite assessment?
So a Red Team Lite assessment is a fairly simple structure, because we wanted to keep it more along the modular style. So it consists of two main components, your external and your internal component, and then it has two additional add-ons. The external component, let's start with that, consists of primarily the first OSINT information gathering stage, which is where we take the domain that the client provides, and we find all the information that we can about it. We find anything about their external-facing infrastructure, if anything's been leaked on GitHub or Google, who their employees are, where their offices are, everything to do around that, just gathering that sort of information. Then we go on to the scanning of that information. So we run stuff like subdomain enumeration to find different subdomains. We see what subnets they're a part of. We sort of get an idea of their entire company and their flow. And then the third aspect of that, which is I think the most important, where I usually find the way in, is essentially the connectivity to the environment. So think about during COVID, a lot of the companies started allowing their employees to work remotely. That necessarily means that they have a VPN or something along those lines. And anytime you have employees accessing the network from an external area, that's where majority of the attacks are going to happen. So I have great success with something that's called password spraying, where essentially you use your OSINT stage to go onto LinkedIn. You find all the employees. You then generate a bunch of email addresses. You can find out if those email addresses are valid. Once you find a whole bunch of valid email addresses, because there's only about 6 different ways in which an email address is structured, you can then start running password sprays. And if your organization is fairly large, the chances of someone having the bare minimum required password of, say, password 1 exclamation mark is fairly high. So if you have about 10 of the most common passwords and you're spraying it over an organization of about 1,000 people, you can often get a hit or two. And if you're lucky, they don't have MFA enabled. Now there's ways to pass MFA if you find an account that is, but that would then be a way into at least to their email. We do have 2 options, and where we differ from red teaming again is if within a certain period of time, which will be discussed in the scope, we don't manage to breach the perimeter, we then move on to the internal assessment via something called assumed breach. Now, assumed breach might come in the way of us giving you a USB stick to execute a file on, or us sending you an email to just click a link or something along those lines. And that basically will give us our initial foothold into the infrastructure if we haven't already got that. Of course, that will then go in the report saying that in order to gain initial access, we had to do this. That is something you wouldn't normally find in red teaming. Usually red teaming, there's very little back and forth like that. You want to see what your actual, is it possible to even breach? But for us, we're looking at a more modular perspective. We want to get that value out of the testing. We don't just want to spend the entire time hitting your external. We want to provide a bit more value, and that's sort of what this is for. So once we get the internal breach, that payload gets executed, or the macro gets executed, downloads our payload. Payload basically creates a connection out to our C2 server, and the internal assessment begins. The internal assessment is actually fairly similar to how we do our internal engagement, where we're not just looking for straight up vulnerabilities running things like Nessus and that. We're actually looking for ways to privilege escalate, ways to laterally move around the network. Now, where it does differ is instead of being very loud, like a normal internal pen test, we're going to be as quiet as possible. We have written ways of bypassing EDR, AV. We're not just immediately going to start blasting crack map exec scans across the network. We're going to be as quiet as possible and try and be stealthy like a real APT would as we worm our way through the environment. We see how far we get, and that sort of ends those 2 components. Now, we have 2 add-ons. The first one is phishing. Phishing will take place simultaneously to the external components. Now, why I've made phishing an external is a lot of clients have either they don't want to be disrupted by the phishing, or they have phishing training programs, which I believe are a lot more efficient in stopping phishing rather than just running a phishing engagement. So we're saving on value there. We don't want to waste precious time on just phishing. And then the second one is your APT simulation, and that's essentially is where we go to the MITR framework and copy a specific APT or a bunch of APTs within that environment and then simulate their exact attack paths. Now, it should be noted that while we're doing our internal engagement and external engagement, we are following these and we're doing more. We're not, because if you think about it, even though take an APT like DarkSide, say for example, on one engagement, they phished a client, got credentials, managed to get into the network, then owned a Windows machine, used PowerShell Empire, for example. That might have just been the C2 server that was the flavor of the month at that time. It doesn't mean that they didn't try something else or they haven't moved on from that. So it's important that you hit every possible escalation path rather than just following a single APT. But in some cases, there is value in copying that exact APT. So we do offer it as a service, but it's not part of the baseline.
Thinking about the stages of a Red Team engagement, how would Red Team Lite differ at each point?
During the OSINT stage, we've used a whole bunch of new AI machine learning tools to cover a lot of the OSINT, so a lot of that is automated. So instead of having a whole team that specializes in OSINT, you can have a single tester running a bunch of code, generating that, and then passing it to sort of find out everything they need to. There's a whole bunch of new tools that have popped up on the market that allow us to go through a whole bunch of dumps of accounts and any sort of breaches you can imagine. We also cut down on the amount of time it would take to gain initial access. So in a traditional Red Team engagement, they're going to spend a lot of time on phishing and physical. So a lot of the time you'll find they will try phish, spearfish, smish, every sort of iteration of it to try gain access. We've cut that away because it takes a large amount of time. And then on top of that, we've also removed the physical aspect. That also takes a large amount of time. Canvassing the building, getting inside, working your way through all the infrastructure and the employees and everything like that. We've removed that section because a lot of SMEs aren't targeted by these nation-state level threat actors that are going to show up to your place of work and try and breach it in the ways that a normal, one of these nation-state level threat actors would. Usually SMEs and even smaller, large entities are going to find the attacks coming from more cyber side of things over the network rather than in person. So you'll see a lot of phishing and a lot of password spraying. So we're focusing more on the network side, what your environment looks like, what can we find on the internet in terms of networking services, GitHub leaks, anything along the lines of third-party breaches, those type of things, rather than spending time on the physical and phishing and that.
How do they make sure that the techniques used mimic the real world and do provide that assurance of how a SOC is going to respond or how resilient the network is going to be?
Essentially how that works is there's two different flavors of Red Team Lite. There's Red Team Lite where we come at the engagement as if it was a threat actor and the company doesn't know anything about it. So the SOC won't be involved or very few people within the company actually know what's going on. And then the other option is we come at it more from a purple teaming perspective where the SOC and that is involved, they know what you're doing, and that's more of, are our systems working? We can check it at every stage of the test. And the techniques that we're using and the tools that we're using are the techniques and tools that are used by the current threat actors. Everything is up to date, and there's even an option around following the exact attack path of one of these threat actors on the MITR framework. But essentially, the test is done completely remotely. It's all conducted through a C2 server, just how a normal a TCP would be mimicking the exact attack paths that these threat actors are currently using.
So you mentioned something that sounds like the blue team has a role to play potentially, not in every engagement, but you can scope the engagement in a way that works with the blue team on this.
Correct. So we can scope it in a way that we basically notify the blue team of each step that we're taking along the way, and that involves all the way from external to internal to privilege escalation, as well as if you take any of the add-ons.
So you'd be giving them things like indicators of compromise they should be picking up with their tools so that they can validate whether it is working or not.
Correct. We will be providing them with the type of attack that we're doing in the section of the infrastructure that we're attacking, as well as, say for example, we're trying to run some type of curb relay to gain access to privilege escalate within the AD environment. We would notify them of this just so they can make sure that their tools are picking it up in the purple team engagement. Yes.
You mentioned the MITRE attack framework. Can you give a brief explanation of what it is and how you would use it as part of the testing?
The MITRE framework is essentially a framework where MITRE go and catalog every APT, and they look at exactly how that APT went about executing whatever they wanted, where it was phishing to ransomware. They sort of map out exactly how it happened as it happened, and that allows us to then go and mimic that.
So it sounds like there's probably quite a lot of collaborative scoping that needs to happen before one of these engagements between the client and the service provider. But for clients that aren't at that point yet, they're maybe thinking about having a pen test, looking at what their options are, what would be the indications that they need a regular pen test, and what would be the indications that they should be looking more at a Red Team or Red Team Lite?
You shouldn't be looking at a red teaming type product if you're not mature in your security journey. They're not there to find a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. And say, for example, you haven't been along the journey, your security journey for that long, and there's still a lot of vulnerabilities in your network. You're going to get a lot more value per pound, per hour out of a normal pen test. Have at least 2 external and internal tests before you move on to the Red Teaming Lite product, and make sure that you're coming out of those internal and external tests with very low sort of findings. They're not, the testers aren't getting to domain admin and those sort of things. Yeah. Or there's another option where you've just implemented a new sort of security measure, whether that be something advanced like dark trace, or you've just implemented a new a fancy EDR solution like CrowdStrike or something like that, and you want to test that out. That's also where you would have more of the red teaming side of things.
And so from the other side, what would you say to testers who are aspiring to get into this sort of more advanced testing?
Essentially, there's a couple of really good certifications paths that you can follow that will get you up to scratch in terms of red teaming. You need to learn a bit of EDR evasion and sort of how these systems work and how to be quiet on an engagement. So I would say you first need to have a little bit of experience in pen testing. And then I would look at doing a certification along the lines of Red Team Operator by 0 Point Labs. They've got 2 certifications that take you through sort of the whole red teaming type space. There's a lot of good material there. But I would first say you need a solid pen testing base. You need to know your way around AD, way around OSINT, and then you need to have a little bit of malware development, because especially when it comes to EDR evasion, when you're looking at bypassing sort of Windows API calls, I would have a little bit of knowledge around that, where it sort of flags how to do that. Because if you take it, for example, you want to run a tool like Mimikatz, that's going to be flagged by everything. It's not just signature evasion that nowadays that you would have to bypass. You have to bypass the actual API calls. So you have to know sort of the new age methodologies around that. So it is more of a reading exercise, and that is going to be personal research. There's not a lot of courses around that. I would recommend OSEE. That is the closest to what I've seen would be a good starter for sort of reverse engineering, malware development, AV evasion, EDR evasion. Yeah.
I think that's been really informative. So we've talked about traditional testing and how it differs from red teaming, and how red teaming can often be quite budget restrictive, and another option that might be Red Teaming Lite for companies that want that sort of output but don't have the budget to justify a full red team test, and also how to get the best out of the test and how to get into it if you're a tester. So that's all been really useful, so thanks very much, Rory.
It's a pleasure, Alex. Thank you.